What is second mind medicine? As you know, if you've been following along for the last several weeks, the last several months, the basic idea of the three minds framework is that we're moving from a physical based view of the world to one that is based in consciousness, right? The idea that the world we experience, while it can be experienced physically, that this physicality and this atomicity or this particularization of the world is simply one way of experiencing the world, right? And depending on the way our minds are configured, depending on the way we use our minds, we perceive the world in a particular way. That's the basic idea of the three minds framework. And we can shift from a particular physical view of the world and from an individual perspective of the world to a more full consciousness-based perspective. And of course, when we're speaking about consciousness here, we're not talking about just my or your particular individual consciousness, right? That is created by the brain, which is the materialist perspective. But we're taking another perspective that there is a non-local field-like nature of consciousness, which appears as the world. So this much we've considered in great detail so far. So what is its application to medicine? Well, many of you know that by training I'm a physician. So since I've been in medical school, I've been wondering about this, right? What is the role of consciousness in healthcare and in medicine? And my exposure to some of these ideas and practices started long before medical school. They started when I was a kid. So there was always this process going on in which the material that was being learned in school and the material which I myself was exploring was being reconciled, right? And that's essentially what you're seeing here. Whatever material is being produced, it's a result of this process of constantly going back and forth and analyzing the experience and the theory and seeing how they can be related. So in medical school, what we learn is that the human body is made up of parts, right? In fact, this is what we learn in elementary school, middle school, and high school, that the human body is made up of parts. And it is based on this theory that the human body is made of parts, right? Specifically protons, neutrons, and electrons, and ultimately atoms. It is based on this theory that we have the biochemical and the biomedical view, right? This is the fundamental approach to medicine, right? We might talk about how do we approach diagnosis? How do we approach treatment? Well, it's based on biomedicine, which is essentially biomolecular medicine, which is, again, based on the atomistic theory of the model of the human being, right? What is the atomistic theory? Very simple, that we are made up of atoms, right? So here's the issue with that. As you know, if you've been looking at this three minds framework and through your own introspection, is that when we look at the human being, we cannot model a human being completely simply through an atomistic framework, right? So this is the basic problem that we face. A human being is much more than a human body, is a simple way of saying it. So no matter how much and how intricately, in how detailed a manner, how comprehensively we model the physical body, it stands to reason that every human being is much more than that, and therefore we are not modeling the whole human being. And if our approach to modeling the human being is that incomplete, and if that's the foundation of medicine, then that incompleteness shows up at every level, right? At the level of diagnosis, right? We are diagnosing based on this atomistic model, based on the physical body. We're treating based on the same thing, right? Our prognosis is based on the same thing. All of these approaches, all of the ways in which we engage with clinical medicine is based on this incomplete theory, this incomplete model of the human being. And of course, for so long, medicine decided that we would cleave the subtle aspect, let's say the mind, let's just call all subtlety the mind, the the field of medicine decided that we would cleave this subtle aspect of being human from the gross aspect, or what we might call the tangible aspect. So we have separated mind and body, right? And the result of this, I think, is much of the chronic disease that we see today, right? Much of the many diseases that we see today is from this separation of the subtle aspect of being human from the more physicalized aspect of being human. And what I'd like to do is show you a little bit of this here. I'm just going to type in this website. So it's secondmindmedicine.com/anatomy, right? So this is to show the anatomic perspective on what I'm talking about. So if you jump over there and just follow along. So at the beginning of this page, it says anatomy means to cut up or to cleave or to see and create divisions, right? So when we talk about anatomy, the word literally means to cut up or to create divisions, right? Now, this is necessarily based on the culture, the theory, the perception that we bring to the table. This is the whole idea behind second mind medicine, right? And then the reason that we see ourselves strictly as a body, if we see that way, is because of the way we were trained, the culture we were trained, the kind of perception that we use. But if we scroll down further and we look at the differences here between the being and the body, on the human body side, of course, we have our organs, we have tissues, we have cells, we have atoms. But if we look at the whole human being, there's an entire list of experiences of how we experience ourselves that is not included in this anatomical, atomistic model of the human being, right? And that is perceptions, right? Perceptions are not considered as part of what we are, part of our anatomy. Thoughts, emotions, what else? Relationships, desires, identity, intuition, meaning, purpose, and so on. So all of these, which in a way mean the most to us, right? If we think about what aspects of our existence mean the most to us, right? Our emotions, our relationships, our sense of meaning, the sense of purpose, how we're feeling right now. None of this can be included in an anatomical model of what we are today in molecular biology or in biomedical medicine, right? So this seems to be a fundamental problem. Now, one of the results of this is that what we have to do is treat primarily based on the physical structure, right? And then we have to create a separate kind of category that we call well-being, or that we call wellness, which is exactly the reason that well-being and wellness as a category has become so popular over decades, because we're primarily attending to the physical aspect of the human being without attending to the subtler aspects, right? So in medicine today, we will see patients saying, hey, I don't feel like I'm heard. I don't feel like I'm seen. And the same thing happens on the physician side, right? So physicians ourselves, many of us feel the same way. And in fact, physician suicide has become a huge issue now, right? The physician suicide rate is something like twice the rate of the general population. So it's this strange situation in healthcare where very often neither does the patient feel seen, nor does the physician or the nurse or other members of the healthcare team feel seen, right? And so what we're suggesting is that all of this is because even though we're human beings, even though we see each other completely, or we feel each other completely as in a conversation, our training, the way we're trained to see each other, is incompletely, partially, and robotically, as if made up of small parts, right? So is this clear? Let me know if this is this coming through clearly. The idea that through this incomplete mechanistic modeling, that we are seeing each other partly and almost as machines, even though as human beings we know we are more than that. So our models do not match our experience. Our models do not account for everything that we know about the human being. All right, so this is the fundamental point. All right, looks like it's coming through. Great. And if there are questions, please do post, because the most important part for me for this is to make this as clear as possible and to address any questions so that we can spread this idea so this can catch on, okay? All right, so I'm on the same page, secondmindmedicine.com/anatomy. And I'm going to go down and read the next thing I wrote here. It's under the section that says a human being is more than a human body, something we all know. Yet, because of the traditional philosophical bias in medicine toward segregating mind from body, we have narrowed our attention to include only human body anatomy, right? As a result, we believe the body is primary, and this is first mind medicine. So the key thing is, it's a traditional philosophical bias, right? One of the key misunderstandings when we talk about second mind medicine is that the science shows that the brain produces consciousness, or the science shows that what we are fundamentally is bodies, right? And that's just not true, right? The idea that the brain is what produces consciousness fundamentally is a philosophical position, right? So the data are consistent. Much of the data is consistent with both sides, that the brain creates consciousness and that consciousness appears as the brain and body. A lot of this depends on how we define consciousness, right? And the definitions we use of consciousness are philosophical in nature. All right, so the traditional philosophical bias is towards what we call materialism, which says that the physical aspect is primary and the mental aspect is secondary, and that the brain, the physical aspect, is what creates the mental aspect. But of course, this doesn't account for what the brain is fundamentally. We haven't answered that question. What is this mind that we're speaking of? We haven't answered that question. And once we begin to question these, we can see that another model is also viable, which is that of the primacy of consciousness. And this is the perspective that second mind medicine takes. All right. So scrolling further down here is the model of anatomy created by the first mind, right? We can see here the brain kind of secreting this mind, as we've seen in many cartoons. I remember seeing in cartoons growing up, you'll have an animal that's thinking, and they depict that by showing the brain and then a series of clouds, right? And in that cloud is a thought. The idea, again, this is the implicit materialist bias, that is, it is coming out of the head that these thoughts appear. It goes on to say that there is evidence to suggest that consciousness is not restricted to the brain. So please do check that out. Denise, I see you mentioned a couple names. I will check that out. Thank you. All right. So check out that link for the evidence suggesting that consciousness is not restricted to the brain. And please leave your comments on that. And now further below, we're still on this same page, secondmindmedicine.com/anatomy. Further below, we see a depiction of the second mind, which is appearing as, or crystallizing as, what we consider this particular experience, right? Including what we traditionally think of as physical anatomy. Now, the key here is that physical anatomy still stays the same, right? We're not reinventing the wheel in terms of understanding physical anatomy. We still understand the organ systems. We still understand the heart and the lungs. We still understand physiology, embryology, all of the fields of medicine, all of the ways in which we divide and understand physical anatomy are still valid, right? That science is certainly still valid. What we're doing is putting that in a broader context and saying that we have to define more of the human being than only this physical structure. All right. So next, we can look at these two, first mind medicine and second mind medicine, side by side, or what we call first mind anatomy and second mind anatomy side by side. Seshni says mind and body link. Yes, exactly. And not only the link between mind and body, but completely merging them, right? We're seeing them as essentially non-different so that we can see them completely. Initially, we have to start with a link because our idea is that the mind is something over here and the body is something over here. That's the idea in medicine right now. In first mind medicine, which is the popular modern medicine, the idea is that these two are fundamentally different. And so, of course, when we believe that two things are fundamentally different, if we want to see them more clearly, or if we want to see what is fundamental to both more clearly, the first step is building the bridge. And that is the link between mind and body. But once we build that bridge, the more we act on that, the more we explore that, then that bridge hopefully may become so wide that it encompasses both. It's no longer a bridge just between two different things, but now we see that these two things that we imagined were different are actually reflections of each other or aspects of each other. Right? So this is the whole idea behind second mind medicine. So if we look at this table here, we see that first mind anatomy sees the body as a machine, and the second mind anatomy sees mind as body as mind. Right? In other words, first mind anatomy is partial human anatomy, and second mind anatomy is whole human anatomy, where we're accounting for perception, feelings, desires, meaning, purpose, everything that we experience. Because after all, if we're talking about anatomy, we're talking about what we are and what we're made of. And we are made up of our sense of meaning and purpose and thoughts and feelings just as much as we are made up of our physicality. Right? And we all experience this every day. First mind anatomy is about personal space. Right? First mind anatomy is about the individual. It's about personal space. Second mind is about relational space. So it's about this space that's here. It's about this space that we are sharing. So your body is in a kind of space. This body is in a kind of space. The objects around us are in a kind of space. And all of these spaces are aspects of a shared space. This is this broad relational space, as opposed to only this personal space. Right? Personal space is important, but by looking strictly at personal space, we cannot understand a human being in her or his entirety, because we are relational experiences. All right. First mind anatomy, again, is based on quantified medicine, right? Quantified measurements. Second mind includes quantified, but also extends to narrative medicine, right? Narrative medicine meaning the stories we tell about each other, the stories we tell about ourselves, right? The sense of meaning we have about who we are and where we're going. All of this is included in the space of second mind medicine. First mind is the atomic model. We talked about this. The second mind is a field-based model, right? What does that mean? We know that in physics, we know that what we're understanding as particles are localized vibrations in broad fields, right? Which essentially suggests that we are moving from an understanding of this world, including our own bodies, as particular things towards being in a fundamental state of energy or information or potential. It depends on the words that we use, right? So even in physics, we are seeing that there is this movement towards the second mind. It is not yet understood as mind or as consciousness, right? That debate is still going on. But what we're seeing is that this field-based view, this non-local view of reality, is this movement towards the second mind. So second mind anatomy is based on a field-like understanding of the human body, as opposed to the first mind, which is based on a particle-based atomistic view. And of course, along with that, the first mind is classical mechanics, second mind is quantum mechanics, and so on. All right, I know I'm going through a lot here, but I'm seeing it looks like people are understanding this here. So Roman says, what is your view on energy or biofield therapy? So the question of energy is one that we still have to answer. That energy affects us, that we are also comprised of energy, is well known, right? The question is, what kind of energy are we talking about? right? So there's energy that we can measure in joules, there's energy we can measure in kilowatt hours, there's energy we can measure in calories, and these are all veritable energy, right? It's called veritable energy, meaning energy that can be measured. But when we talk about putative energy, this is a kind of energy that we cannot measure yet. And much of the healing traditions of the world, many of them, such as yoga, for example, or Ayurveda, the kind of energy that's referred to is not necessarily an energy that can be independently measured, right? Its expression can be measured either in the forms of how we feel or how we express or how the body expresses, but they directly cannot be measured so far. And so this is where the conversation stands on energy, but certainly in terms of how we can heal the body, different forms of energy are definitely in play. And I certainly think that's possible. And that's exactly what we're talking about. We're moving towards that. As we scroll down this page, we'll talk about these different levels of human anatomy, including energy. Right? Ursula Maxey says, where is it? So I'm not sure if you can clarify the question. I'm not sure what this refers to. Where is which? What particular entity are you talking about here? All right. Let's see. Seshni says holistic view and approach, Biocycle Social approach, as we do in psychiatry. Yes. So Seshni, take a look at the blog on secondmindmedicine.com. I actually have written about the Biocycle Social view and why it actually has not worked, right? I think in theory, it sounds great. And in practice, especially in allopathic medicine, in practice, we are certainly trying to get there. But I think as it was proposed by, I think it was Engel many decades ago, I think it has not lived up to its potential. So I've written about the Biocycle Social view on the blog. You can check that out, and please do leave your comments there. Right? Show Marie says, we are relational experiences, field-based mind. Yes. This is exactly the idea, that we don't have to confine ourselves to a particle view or as strictly as individuals or things, that we can move across the spectrum of particularity, relationship, and more of a field-based view. The intersubjective space, Denise says, in psychotherapy, the relational space. Yes, intersubjective. And this word intersubjective can be used to describe all of what we call objective phenomena, right? Moving aside from just second mind medicine, if we just broadly look at the second mind as we've been talking about it, if we look at this hand, for example, we would traditionally describe this as objective, right? From a materialist perspective, we'd say this is an objective hand. We see it objectively. But it's actually intersubjective in that how we see this very much depends on the kinds of nervous system looking at it, right? So you and I agree that this is a hand, and therefore it's intersubjective, right? But an animal with a different nervous system does not see the same thing that we see, right? And you and I ourselves don't see the same thing, right? When I look at this hand and you look at this hand, we're seeing it differently. So we have intersubjective agreement, but what we've decided is simply to say, well, you know, it's objective. It's objective enough for us, right? Meaning that relative to a private thought or a private feeling that we might have, this hand is relatively less subjective. It's intersubjective. But yes, this is exactly the idea, that there is this space that is intersubjective that we create together, so to speak, which is the basis or a basis for healing beyond the personal individual space. All right, Bonnie, thank you. Glad to know that it's making sense. Just scrolling through a few more of these comments here. So here's a question. I'm not sure if I understand it, Ursula, but I'm going to try to respond. You're saying, are we not getting too deep in, I think the word is psychology, that afterwards human is trapped? So yes, if what I'm saying and if second mind medicine is interpreted as strictly a psychological phenomenon or strictly to do with mind, right, and ignoring the body, or strictly as an intellectual framework, then it's just becomes another problem, right? The idea, hopefully, is to present a framework that we can use as a map to talk about ourselves and model ourselves, right? I'm trying to see somewhere over here. I had my Atlas of Human Anatomy from medical school, right? So it says it's called Netter's Atlas of Human Anatomy. And though it says the Atlas of Human Anatomy, what it is showing is strictly the body. So it's not human anatomy as a whole, especially from experiential and phenomenological perspectives. It's simply human body anatomy, right? So the reason I say that is because that atlas is a map of what we are, right? It's not a complete map. It's as if you were drawing a map of how to go from the east coast of the United States to the west coast of the United States, but you only drew up to the Midwest, right? Or you only drew the states on the east coast, and you left out on that map all of the states in the Midwest and on the west coast, right? Now, if I tried to get to that west coast, I would get lost because the map is incomplete, right? Now, I would be right sometimes because I would get through a couple states moving in the right direction, and if I kept going, maybe I would get there. But the map itself would be radically incomplete, and this is the same thing we're talking about here. At the same time, if we have a complete map, and if we stick with that map, and we never get on the road, and we never actually drive, then that presents a new kind of problem. So this is the way I would see what you're saying, Ursula, that, if this is interpreted strictly as psychology, then it becomes another problem, right? Even though I use the word second mind medicine, this second mind actually refers to everything, right? It is not the equivalent of the first mind, which refers to strictly our thoughts or our feelings. All right. Jean-Philippe says, does flow thinking apply to second mind medicine? Emotion, body, transformation? Absolutely. And we'll see that when we get up to the model. So we may have to go to a second talk for this. We'll see. But absolutely, the whole idea when we invert the model, instead of saying that the body is primary and it creates consciousness and we keep out everything else, emotion, meaning, purpose, etc., when you turn it inside out, you're saying the fundamental nature of reality is a non-local transpersonal consciousness. And from there, through meaning, we are, in a sense, building the body, or the body is materialized in that sense, right? It's analogous to how physics talks about the fundamental nature being, let's say, fields of energy, right? At least as far as we know now. Or some people say information is fundamental. And from this information, which is not something that we can touch necessarily, this information builds itself up or interprets itself as energy, and then ultimately as feelings, thoughts, and as the body, right? This is a view based in physics or based in a different philosophy. Well, we're simply turning that around and saying that information itself is a representation of intelligence that we are calling consciousness, right? So that would be entirely consistent with saying then, based on our emotion, if we can access our emotions and process them, then that naturally changes how the body is. And we know this to be the case in some cases already, because we know there's an association between tension, right, mental tension that we hold, and, for example, low back pain or neck pain, right? We know there's an association between stress and, let's say, gastric ulcers, right? So this association between our emotions and our mind and how they affect the body is well known. It's just that the entirety of that relationship is not well understood. And that's what we're trying to map here. So Denise says, when we work with trauma symptoms, they're felt in the body. It's often used to raise awareness. Yes, very much so, because trauma is an extreme and concentrated kind of emotion, right? There's a concentrated, heavy type of emotion in trauma, and so that's very likely to show up in the body in some way. And if that emotion can be accessed and released, then there's often a release in the body as well. All right, so let's keep going here. This is an interesting quote. This is a professor, Shigehisa Kuriyama. He wrote this book called The Expressiveness of the Body, in which he said, in Hua Shu, we miss the muscular detail of the Vesalian man. Vesalian man is that image. You can Google Vesalian man. It's the image of the human being as muscular anatomy, right? You can see the muscles. So he says, in this tradition, we miss the muscular detail of the Vesalian man. And in fact, Chinese doctors lacked even a specific word for muscle. Muscularity was peculiarly Western. On the other hand, the tracks and points of acupuncture entirely escape the West's anatomical vision of reality. And the key phrase here is anatomical vision of reality. We're so used to thinking about anatomy not as vision, but as what is, right? As what we already know to be true. But we are now shifting in second mind medicine to a view in which we understand that anatomy is not something, the way we describe anatomy is not something that's already there. It's actually we superimposing our vision on the human being, right? And we noting down or marking or drawing that which we can perceive and that which we are comfortable with, right? Because there are some things we cannot perceive that other cultures seem to perceive, including in yoga, the chakras and the nadis, or in Chinese medicine, acupuncture. I mean, the acupuncture points and the meridians, right? So there's some kinds of anatomy that we are not seeing that other cultures are detailing, right? So if our perception isn't there, then we won't note these aspects of anatomy. But it's not just perception, it's also comfort. Because we all experience mind, we all experience thought or perception, feeling, emotion, intention, desire, meaning, purpose. All of this we experience, but this won't show up in our anatomical models because we are not comfortable moving between mind and body. Even though we all perceive it, we're not comfortable moving between the two and relating to the two. And so we simply say, well, all that stuff, that's secondary to the brain. That's secondary to the body, so we're going to ignore that, right? So both of these are required. Colette asks how to differentiate psychosomatic diseases from organic mechanic diseases. Well, I think one of the first things we have to do, Colette, if you check the blog on Second Mind, I'll put that, I think this is the website, /blog. If you check this, there is a blog, there's a post that I titled, We All Have Psychosomatic Order, right? So we often hear about psychosomatic disorder, right? Which is that, well, there's a problem in the body caused by the mind, right? But I think we should look at it from the other perspective first, which is that we are all ordered psychosomatically. We are psychosomatically ordered, right? Our very structure and our anatomy is psychosomatic, right? And in fact, not just psychosomatic, but everything, all the layers of human being are together. And so it's not just one condition that's being caused by the mind, but all conditions are interplays of mind and body and energy and information and all of these layers. And we have to figure out how to reconcile and translate among these layers. All right. And we haven't gotten to the 5 bodies yet. Maybe this is a good place to stop and do that next time, right? Let's do that. So you can go on and look. It's there on the anatomy page. I'll put that one too one last time. So if you go to the anatomy page, you can scroll down and finish through how I describe the 5 layers of human anatomy, the 5 layers of complete human anatomy. And what we'll do next time is we'll look at those 5 and describe them, and then we'll talk about what the implications are for healing, right? Joanne says, science over stigmas. Is there a best culture that supports mental health? Yes, exactly. Right? The bottom line is what works, right? That's got to be the final position, right? What works? What is offering the greatest access to healing, right? The greatest access to diagnosis. And it ultimately has to work. And that's got to be where we place our bets.